Good evening, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome for joining us. We are going to, I think we'll go ahead and just get started right away. I know there's still some people joining from the waiting room, and we'll go ahead and continue to open that up and let people in, but we want to make sure we save as much time as possible for conversation with our guest Dani tonight. So thank you all for being here. Please feel free to continue to introduce yourselves in the chat, answer the joining question. It's always so great to learn a little bit about the people who are with us this evening. So thank you for doing that. If you are with us tonight, we hope you're here to engage respectfully. I'll just go over a few norms and then we'll do introductions. Feel free to use the chat throughout the evening tonight, throughout our coffee and conversation. We value your voices. We want to hear from all of our guests that are with us this evening and all of you. Feel free to share constructive ideas, resources, comments as you want to. Also, as noted on the event page, we are recording this evening and we'll be sharing the presentation portion of our evening tonight on our website on Achieve the Core. We won't be recording when you go to Breakout Groups, and we won't be recording your individual conversations. We'll have opportunity after the breakout group time to come back together for some question and answering sessions from our guest Dani. So please keep track of your questions for her throughout the time tonight, and we'll have time at the end for that. And then we just want to make sure that you all know that this is a very safe space for each other to be here. And so any participation in cyberbullying or deliberate attempts to intimidate other guests or commenters or disrupt the conversation, those people will promptly be removed from our session tonight. And lastly, we hope that you'll feel free to discuss the conversation on social media this evening during our session and also continue the conversation afterwards. Feel free to tweet at Achieve the Core and use hashtag Core Advocates. And also Dani and my Twitter handles are there also if you want to tweet at us as well. So I'm going to, with no further delay, have our guest Dani Wadlington introduce herself to all of you.
Hello, everybody. It's so great to be here this evening. I'm so happy to share space with y'all. My name is Dani Wadlington, originally from Chicago, but I live in the Bay now. I've been teaching for 12 years. This is my 12th year in the classroom. Always taught math. I've loved math ever since I was little, and so I'm just happy to now be shifting my work to something that's a whole lot more critical than I think when I entered the field. And so I'm happy to share the knowledge that I have with y'all today and share a little bit about the work that I do both within and beyond the classroom. Thank you. Yes,
Great,
I see
thanks.
From Chicago. I love it.
Thanks, Dani. Everybody will have lots more time to learn a little bit more about Dani as the evening goes on tonight. But I wanted to share with you one of the reasons we're here is to share with you the Pathway to Equitable Math Instruction, which is available at equitablemath.org. There are 5 strides is what it's called. It's kind of like 5 different chapters in an online resource for educators who are interested in equitable math instruction and anti-racist teaching practices. And we'll be talking a little bit more in depth about Stride 1 tonight, which is called Dismantling Racism in Mathematics Instruction. And Dani was one of the co-authors of Stride 1. And so she has lots of insight and knowledge about the toolkit and Stride 1 in particular that she'll be sharing with us this evening. So we're going to get right into our conversation, which is super exciting. So I'd love, Dani, thank you for being here and sharing your knowledge and wisdom with us. I'd love for you to share, particularly at this very moment in time, why this work is so important for educators.
Well, I mean, I think the events of this past weekend are just more and more evidence of why we need to do this type of work. To see another Black man lost, another life lost to police violence, to state-sanctioned violence. And I want to name that it's not just police violence, it is state-sanctioned violence. And I think we need to think about it that way because we realize that public education is also state-sanctioned. And so we need to really think about what it is that we're doing in our learning spaces. Because if not, there's going to be just continuous cycles of oppression, and we need to break that. We really need to break that. When we think about the violence against Asian Americans that is happening right now, like, we need to break that cycle. And I think that a lot of times we try to do that outside of the math classroom, where we say that it doesn't have a place inside of our math classrooms, but our people are in math classrooms. Our people experience this every day. And if we really believe and value in bringing the whole student to the classroom, we cannot ignore their experiences. We cannot ignore what they face, and we cannot separate our education from that. That means that our math, everything that we do, needs to be in support of folks. And I feel wholeheartedly that we really need to be doing this type of work, not just now because we're in this moment, but forever, until we get to a place where we're not in that. And even when and if we get there, we still need to do it so that we can prevent it from happening again. I think about too, right, like specifically in math, I think last week, there was a story about that came out in the news about, again, people using math and the defense. Okay, well, to tell you a little bit about the problem, it was basically about slave owners and slavery, and saying how many more slaves would a slave owner have to purchase in order to meet an economic goal. Sorry, I'm outside because there's a lot happening in my home. So please excuse me on there. But I think about that, and we think that those stories are like, oh my gosh, sensational, or they're far removed and they're not happening that way. But that was literally like 2 weeks ago, when a teacher attempting to bring math into their classroom did it in that kind of way. And then the school district apologizing, but still justifying it as, well, they were trying to understand the economic impacts of that time. But the economic impacts of that time, like, you can't reduce people to that, right? Like, when you sort of reinforce this idea that people are commodities, even as you're apologizing, it's like, what is that? Why is that happening? And so we just can't like, we just can't keep doing this. And again, we think those things are far removed, but even there's an article by Dani Martin that talks about anti-Blackness, and they bring in all these sort of math problems that exist and show up in spaces. And you're like, dang, that was 2013. Dang, that was 2017. Like, that's not that far, and it continues to happen. And people act shocked every time that it makes the news. But I also want to think about, every time that it makes the news, it's probably a whole lot more times that aren't making the news. And so we really have to do this work, because it's more than time. It is more than time. We need to do this now.
Thank you for such like an emotional week to be having this conversation. And so I really appreciate your honesty and willingness to engage in a really tough week for a lot of people. You're a high school teacher, and when you were talking, I was thinking about your students. They've been in the system for 9, 10, 11, 12 years. I don't know, do you have like stories of impact on like specific students, or I want to stay in this, like, why is this work important? And I don't know if you could bring it like even to a student perspective or a student level, but.
Yeah, I mean, I think about even now, so like, there's a day that like I paused and talked about like just sharing solidarity with our Asian students, and a student messaged me, and she was like, this is the first teacher that has talked about this. And I didn't see them until Wednesday. This stuff happened over the weekend. I was like, we saw them Monday, we saw them Tuesday. This was, advisory, so I didn't see the student until Wednesday. And I was like, and I felt like personally, like, I hadn't said anything too, right? Like, so it took me a while because I was still healing from it. And I was like, I'm not in a space to have this conversation with students, but I know that it's important, which is why I wanted to wait until, for me personally, till I was in a space that was a little bit safer to share. And that was very intentional. Again, not trying to, I want to make it clear that like I did that because that's what I needed, but I also knew that I needed to show up for students. And so I did talk about it with my other students too. But when she was saying like, you're the first teacher to talk about it, my heart broke, both with guilt for not saying something sooner, but then also that like, I think I walked away from that conversation wondering if other teachers were going to address it. I think sometimes, right, like people do need time and space. We're people too. We are people too. So we have to take care of ourselves in order to show up for our students. But I wasn't sure. I wasn't sure that other teachers were going to show up for that student in that way. Um, and that, like, again, is why it's important because one, someone needs to, and two, I think that particularly for teachers of color, this falls on them. And for us, like, I think this is a call for white allies and colleagues. Like, sometimes you have to take on that burden. You have to take on that labor. You have to step up in that way because sometimes we are just tired. We don't have it the same way our kids don't always have it. And I think that's really important because I can fight and fight and fight, and I can do what we can do, and like our communities can do everything that we can do. But sometimes we need help, and not like help to do it for us, not help to take over. I think one of our like norms at Quetzal Education Consulting, that's my consulting firm, we always have this norm of like step up, step back. And what that means is not like, you know, take up space and talk if you're a person who doesn't talk much. And like, you know, if you are a person who talks a lot, maybe step back. No, we say like white folks need to step up in labor and people of color need to step up in power. Because that's what shifting the dynamics looks like. That's what it takes. Because we can't hold all of this. Like we can't hold all the labor all the time. We can't do all the work and be there for students and be there for ourselves and be there for our communities and our families and not have that support. So I really want us to make sure that we do that.
Thank you for saying that. I feel like, so it's so important to acknowledge that something like about 80% of the teaching force is white. And that's a whole nother conversation that we could talk about and a whole nother problem. But if the white folks don't step up and do the work won't get done. And like you said, the burden on educators, teachers of color specifically, is really great. So I think that's a good segue to our next conversation, which is how then do we do the work? The work's important. We know that. We know it's critical. We know that all educators need to do it. All teachers need to do it. So what are your thoughts on how we do work?
So I want to name that. I'm gonna tell you how I do the work and some ideas, but like what I say is not the end all be all, right? Like everybody has their lane, everybody has their strength, everybody has their passion, everybody has their skill set. And so I do think though, one thing that I have found really helpful is to really visibilize white supremacy culture. And I think the reason why that's important is because one, it's invisibilized. Two, it impacts us all the time. Three, we don't always see how and why things are happening. And it's because it's designed that way. I think about all of the pushback. I know we're going to talk about the toolkit in a little bit, but I think about all the pushback from the toolkit, and people are like, oh my gosh, I can't believe they said math is racist. First of all, that's not what I said, but since you're going there, right, the fact that you feel a discomfort with that is a place to really like sit. And so there's so much energy that's being put into arguing the idea that like math needs to take an anti-racist approach. And like without even realizing it, the way that they're fighting, the language that they're using is also very racist. It's a racist ideology. And so I think that like because of that, well, not because of that, but I think that that happens, or that's allowed to happen because like it's so systemic and so set up to like distract us from doing this kind of work that we miss it. And so I think about like all the emails I get about doing this work, and I'm just like, I don't even have time and energy for this because you're literally taking away from the work right now. But I think that what has given me power to address that is to think about like white supremacy culture. And I also want to note that like I call it white supremacy culture because that is the name that it is given. But I think one, we also have to unpack our language, because I think when we use terms like white supremacy or white privilege, I understand them intellectually, but then like the language also makes it seem like if you're white, you are therefore privileged. And I think, yes, societally, but like, what would it mean to decolonize that language? Because it is not a privilege to be white. Like, just because you're white does not mean you're supremacist, right? Or like the idea of being supreme. Supreme is like big, beautiful, powerful. And like, why are we attaching that to one thing? So sorry, that was a little bit of a side note.
Yeah.
But anyways, I like to like really think about what white supremacy culture is, and particular as a person of color, because I think that a lot of times, like I've been in spaces where I or other folks have been like, oh, I'm like Black, or oh, I'm this, and I can kind of do no wrong. And it's like, nah, we have white supremacy culture in us too. And if we're not mindful about our spaces and about the work that we do, then we can start to perpetuate that without even realizing it, and can work against anti-racist work. Now, that said, I think we also need to understand what anti-racist work is, because if we stick and stay with white supremacy culture, if we don't actually do the work around anti-racism, then we're like more knowledgeable in this thing that exists, but we're not more powerful necessarily against it. And so one of the things that you know we've been able to contribute is this toolkit, right? The toolkit is like amazing, and I know I'm mostly talking about, well, sorry, amazing for the whole toolkit. I'm going to focus on stride 1 because I think that's what we had a hand in. And I think like 1, it's just powerful because that entire stride was written by all people of color, which is like which is amazing, right? And then that was really designed to think about how sort of white supremacy culture comes up in math classrooms all the time, and really thinking about how can we like get away from that. And so I really, really want to, as you're looking at the toolkit, or if you have access to the toolkit and as you're working through it, I think the most important pages on there are 8 and 9, which are the characteristics of anti-racist math teachers, because it really talks about how to do math differently. And I know that the whole workbook is thinking about like, is unpacking white supremacy culture, but the reflections in there are designed for you to take those anti-racist practices kind of as like antidotes to this white supremacy culture so that you can do it. And I think so I really want to make sure that you, if you're looking at the toolkit and using the toolkit, and if you're not a math teacher, you know, you can apply those things to your own spaces as well. But to really look at what it means to do anti-racist work in math. For me particular, I think I've been working on making rigor accessible through strong scaffolding. And I have really taken that on in distance learning because one, people are in such different spaces right now. So really just trying to think about how do you create and design lessons for all the students in your classroom, thinking about not only like thinking about their race, their gender, all of the multiple identities that students bring to you, but also their situations too, right? Like what happens if a student can't come to class? What happens if a student is on their phone and they only have one device? What happens if, you know, like planning for all of those things. And so I've been really thinking about how do I scaffold so that the math is still rigorous, but not inaccessible. But what sometimes happens when people do that is that they over scaffold. So also being mindful of like not over scaffolding as well, because we don't want to make assumptions about students. So I've been really thinking about how to do that practically, and I can talk more about that if you want to reach out, talk more about how I use Desmos in particular to creatively scaffold. But I think that's the one that's been sitting heavy with me, and then also how to make my math space more culturally sustaining, especially when we're not in the classroom, and really thinking about that. And I think for me, just trying to provide safe spaces for students to be mathematicians and people at the same time. That means spending 20 to 30 minutes on community building. And I know that seems like, oh my gosh, that's half the class, but you know what? we get through the same amount of work as my colleagues who are also, I'm not throwing them out there, they also do a lot of community building. We use the same things, we use the same sources, but same resources. But I think that like, you know, we're intentional. Our math department is really intentional about anti-racist work and really showing up and being there for students. I say this for myself, but I know that other colleagues who I've worked with even now and in the past, math is my context for what I want to teach. It is not like, content is not like, math is just like, it's the content, but like not, right? Like I want people
I love that.
I want people to be able to think. I want them to communicate. I want them to be able to live freely, express themselves, do whatever they need to do. And so like the way that might show up in class is like, okay, maybe they don't have to write. So like sometimes I'm like, can you explain this? Or like, you know, or tell me what you're thinking. And sometimes they draw pictures. Sometimes they like, I really wish that we had a voice recording thing, because then I know that people would use that instead of typing. But just like giving them multiple ways to express and be, and I think that like that helps the math get done, right? A lot of times, like particularly in math, there's like so much anxiety around math, and like lowering that is really, really, really important. And you can do that by just letting them be, by just honoring who they are. And that in itself is not necessarily a simple thing, but it is something that everyone can do right now. Just pause, take a moment, ask them a little bit about themselves, and students will share. And if they don't share, that's okay. Note, like maybe they don't want to share, but maybe also like that's just not the culture of the class, and you need to think about what shifts you need to make in your class so that they do feel comfortable sharing. And I say that too because I feel like another thing in distance learning right now that I hear a lot from teachers when they're like, oh my gosh, they're so silent, how do I know that they're there? I'm like, yo, when y'all were in person, you were asking folks to be silent, you were like, oh, okay, they're paying attention, they're silent, I know they're paying attention. They're doing the same thing. They're doing the same thing right now. So really like honoring students where they are and honoring their experiences. I promise you will get so much further in whatever it is you want to teach if you do that.
I love that. I like how you also, like you kind of spoke to both sides of stride one, the reflection pieces and all the months. I was thinking, it's been a little while since I've been in the classroom teaching math, but I was thinking how some of those characteristics of white supremacy culture showed up in my classroom, and like reflecting on that when I was a teacher and thinking how like one right way. Like I always let kids do lots of different methods and solutions and things, but I know still there were some things that I was so set on, like, this is the right way we're going to do this in this classroom. And so I like how that part of it helps teachers reflect on ways in which that white supremacy culture shows up. But then also like pages 8 and 9 you mentioned is sort of the kind of a playbook for what to do differently. So I know somebody in the chat said, can you give like one example, or I don't know if you have a specific example of something from like say pages 8 and 9 or any part of the toolkit, you know, from your classroom or something you've done with students.
I'm trying to think. So sometimes, okay, so right now, right, I don't know, Breaking Bad is like one movie that I really like, or one TV show that I really like. And so I was like, how do you get student, like how do we think about like just how do I make area, volume, service area, how do I make that important? And then I realized like, I don't know that I can, I'm sure there's a way to make it important. Don't get me wrong, so don't misquote me. But I think that like sometimes we also just need to give students time for fun, right? And I think that like they had fun figuring out like, does Walter White really have $80 million? And we took like the volume of like money and like looked at the barrels and like found out the volume of the barrels, and they're like looking at all of these things and saying like, could he actually have that? And like just being like, whoa, like, you know, and I mean, it's not necessarily like a what they might experience on a day-to-day, but like it's fun. And they had fun with it. And then, you know, we get to talk about the show and they get to do that. And so then it's just like, you know, it's just fun for students. That's like more of an example of like, to me, that's not a direct, but a very indirect way of like so one of the anti-racist characteristics is to make sure that students have access to STEM fields, and they will get pushed out of math if they don't really like it. And so I think that we really need to figure out how to incorporate fun into the classroom. When I also think about another activity that I had students do, it was measuring the ramp. So using, we use like a squared plus b squared equals c squared, and like sine, cosine, like inverse angles, inverse trig functions to figure out if like the ramps on our campus were ADA compliant, right? And so then it gives us a chance to talk about like, what is ADA? Like, how does it affect us? What, like, how many of us walk this world or walk this earth with invisible disabilities or learning differences? I don't want to necessarily say disabilities, but you know, like, and it gives us time and space to like talk about that and still do math. And so I think that like there's a lot of different ways that this shows up in sort of the curriculum. But again, it shows up there because like I want to, again, know who kids are. I want them to be comfortable with their experiences. And like, you know, a kid was talking about Breaking Bad one day, and that's how it happened. I wasn't just like, let's do Breaking Bad. Like that came up because a student was talking about it. And I was like, all right, we can do this. We can do this.
I love it. Thank you for those examples. Super concrete and helpful. And thinking, I can just picture your community of learners in your classroom and kids getting into the math. So that's exciting. We might have already touched on this, but do you have any like other things that we should be mindful of when we're thinking of like, you know, anti-racist classrooms and attending to students?
I would say I have two big ones. Again, there's more, but one of them is to really be cognizant of, well, actually three, really be cognizant of intersectionality. A lot of times when we start to do anti-racist work, we get so caught up in race, we don't realize how other things like gender, sexuality, abilities, and all these other intersectionalities that folks have and bring with them to the classroom, they get missed, or they get overlooked, or they get minimized. And I want to make sure that that doesn't happen, and that you really do take an intersectional lens and approach in this work. So that's the first thing. The second thing, I hear this a lot, like what happens if I don't have students of color? Your white students need this type of work too, because when they walk out into the world, there are other folks and they need it, right? Like I think that the work that white folks and white folks in general need to do is different. And I think that like what that means, right, needs to be unpacked, and that work still needs to happen whether you have students of color in your classroom or not. And then the third thing is to like just continuously do learning, right? Like right now, anti-racism seems really, and once that gets trendy and once we talk about it, its name is going to change, but this work will still need to happen. So I think that like one, things change, context changes, your values shouldn't, even as like, you know, culture changes and generations change. But what that means then is like the way that we carry out this work might look different, but the work still needs to get done.
Thank you. Such good, important reminders, and thinking of, you know, how folks can engage even beyond this copying conversation this evening. We're gonna transition and give you all a chance to chat with one another in breakout groups this evening. So we're gonna send you to breakout groups for just about 10 minutes. Hopefully you'll be able to meet somebody from maybe another part of the country, another perspective as you, and have some really great conversation about some of the things that Dani shared and some of the things she talked about. So when you get into your breakout groups, introduce one another. You can introduce yourselves and say what you do and where you're from, and you know, whatever you want to feel comfortable getting to know one another in the breakout group. And then feel free to reflect and discuss the conversation that you just heard. Anything that stood out to you, anything that you want to like discuss with your groups. But we also would encourage you to open up Stride 1 and just scan pages 8 and 9. I know Dani mentioned those pages as sort of a blueprint for anti-racist teaching and what an anti-racist math classroom might look like. And so you could scan those 2 pages also really quickly and have a conversation around how can we as a collective group, because there's a lot of us on this copying conversation tonight, there's a lot of power in this group. how can we collectively embody characteristics of anti-racist teaching in our roles, in our classrooms, in our leadership, if you're a leader, in the role that you hold in schools and school districts. So we're going to, I think, if Vicky's ready, we're going to send you out into breakout groups, have about a 10-minute conversation, and we'll come back with enough time to do Q&A. And so feel free also to hold your questions that you might have for Dani, and we'll do that when you all come back. Welcome back, everyone. We have just about 15 more seconds and then everybody will be brought back and we'll get started again. Welcome back all. Thank you for rejoining us. Hopefully you found those conversations engaging and enjoyable. And I know that a few of you might have been by yourself or just with one other person. So if that was the case, we apologize. We were doing some shuffling mid-group to try to make sure everybody had somebody to talk with. So hopefully you enjoyed that. My colleague Vicky is going to share her screen, and we have a little bit of time, about 15 minutes for some Q&A with Dani. And so if you have questions with her, you'll be able to ask those questions. So I think Vicky's going to put up a...
Hi everyone, yes, so you have the link to our poll everywhere in the chat where you can submit your questions and upvote the questions of others. And as those come in, I'll share my screen so that you all can see what's happening live.
Great, so go ahead and use that poll everywhere link to add your questions for Dani. I'll put it in one more time also.
While you all are generating questions, I'll go ahead and answer the first one. So I think, like, how do you encourage teachers who don't know the right words and fear making it worse? Is that one, right? Like, fear with this kind of work is kind of inevitable. So like, know that and own it and then work through it. And I think that, like, so we'll share some resources with you, but not having the right language, again, that comes with like reading and making yourself knowledgeable with that language. So like I said, for myself personally, when I was able to name things as white supremacy culture using the specific language that was already in the article, which is also linked in Strad 1 and Strad 2, and I'm talking about the work by Tema Okun and Kenneth Jones. It helped me to sort of name why or name how this work, it sort of named what I was experiencing. So then I could figure out what I needed to do. And so one, I would say read. There is so much, but also like do the work. The only way you're gonna find out, one, that you can do it is by doing it. So I understand that it's can be fearful at times, but doing it is the only way to know how to do it. And if you make mistakes, we all make mistakes, right? Like we all have areas of growth, and just listen when someone calls you out about something, or if you realize yourself, oh, that wasn't right, or that didn't feel right. Sit with that, reflect on it, figure out, okay, what happened, what was going on, what did I do, what was happening, and what do I need to do differently, and then do that. And the more that you do this work, the further along you get, the more mistakes you'll make, and then you just get better and you get better and get better. Now, saying that doesn't mean I'm not giving you a license to go out there messing things up now. don't do that. But right, like when you do make a mistake, because there are people who do just, sometimes that happens. Own it, correct your course, and keep doing it. Some strategies and resources. So again, we'll share some resources. I really love the work of Dani Martin, Rochelle Gutierrez, Carrie Coca. Like that work is really good. I'll add that to the resource list as well. But there's so much out there that it's hard to like name a few folks. But I think if you read some of the work of the folks I named, it will inevitably give you more links to click on to read other work as well. How are districts systematically reaching teachers with this work? So, okay, this is a really good question because I think that, right, Stride 1 is written as a 1-year plan. However, it can live past that 1 year, and some people can't do everything in the toolkit for 1 year. Some folks need to just do one the entire year, and that's okay. I think that we wanted to give as much resources as possible, but you don't have to stick with the timeline that is in the toolkit. In fact, I encourage you to go beyond that, extend things as you need to extend them. Maybe something isn't, maybe that's like, oh, actually, I'm good with that. I don't need to do that work. Move on to a different month. And I would say it's okay to not necessarily follow it as planned. Or as exactly as written. And you can also hire Quetzal Education Consulting. We actually have we actually are working with a district right now doing some more in-depth professional development around the toolkit, around the ideas in the toolkit. So call us up, reach out to us. We can make that happen for you.
I'll do a plug also, Dani, for we have a series which I hate to plug for it because it's full, but we've been leading with Dani and a few other educators and Math Ed leaders a seminar series around dismantling racism in mathematics. And while that's full and already started, we are planning to put together an asynchronous course that folks will be able to join and use as well in the future. So I feel like there's lots of, I've recently learned of lots of ways individual teachers, school cohorts, and districts have been picking up the toolkit and thinking about ways to use it. And it really just takes, I think it just takes a willingness for folks to examine their practice and be reflective and dig in. So great. I think we have time for another question or two. So you can feel free to pick a question.
Let's see. So I think I don't want to really get into the pushback, but I think it's just new for some folks. Like people will push back against anti-racist work always because that's what racism does. And so I wouldn't spend your energy trying to unpack that because it don't make no sense. So like just keep doing this work. I would say like, the pushback is welcome. That means we're pushing the right buttons and we're doing the right thing. Must have strategies for brand new teachers. I would just encourage you to really question what you've just learned. Teacher education programs are also not doing work. So as you do this work and as you're negotiating, like you're learning, really think about like, am I really doing the right thing? And even though this institution told me to do it this way, because institutions are typically white spaces, and so you want to question critically what you've learned, right? Don't question yourself so much that you don't do anything, but really be mindful. Do what you can. Don't overwork yourself. You will have years to continue working. Prioritize rest. How you start off your first year your first few years will greatly impact the rest of your own career. So treat it like you would a baby, right? Like it is a big part of who you are, what you do, and you impact a lot of lives. So just be really mindful and take care of yourself.
Great. Vicki, is there one more? I think we have time for one more question before we close out this evening.
Can we go to the next one? Sorry, that question requires a really long response, and so I invite you to ask me that via email. Grading practices, anytime there's grades involved, there's always going to be bias, and so I don't know that like there is a right way to do that. To me, it would be no grades. And there are schools that do that. So when people say it can't be done, it's not true, because there are schools that don't have grades. Anytime you're evaluating folks, there's going to be bias, and so there's not really a way around that. There are ways, of course, to do it more equitably, and there are resources. I see them dropping them in the link. There are definitely ways to do it better, but it's always questioning what is the purpose of this? How is it being used? And if you can't answer those two questions, then I don't really know what to tell you. I don't have good answers there, but I think that grades will inherently be inequitable. We can always do better.
Great. Do you have any thoughts, Dani, just as a closing idea around the other 4 strides? And I don't know if you have any thoughts about the use of them or where folks should start, or.
Yeah, so I would say, I would say that the other ones are not necessarily like timeline based. They are tools that you can use, right? Like coaching tools you can use, and that really would depend on who you're coaching and how you're coaching. There's tools around language. There's like mapping out the standards. The one thing I will say is that the tools, though all of them were written with Black students, Latinx students, and multilingual students in mind, particularly in grades 6 through 8, they can be applied the same, like they can really be applied to grade levels beyond 6th through 8th. And I really do believe that the principles behind the tools, which as you engage with them, can be used outside of math as well. And so I would really encourage all the folks who are here, whether you are math or not, whether you are a middle school teacher or not, to really look at them and think about how they can be used, because they're really powerful tools.
Great, thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and close out. And I saw somebody ask in the chat about sharing resources, so I want to definitely speak to that. So Dani mentioned her consulting organization. And so if you are, I think somebody dropped a link in the chat also, but if you're interested in getting in touch with them or just staying informed, you can follow them on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter. And also Dani's Instagram and Twitter are there as well. And so feel free to continue engaging with Dani and the organization around this work, and sharing your stories, sharing what you all are doing, and just continuing the conversation. I feel like I don't have maybe the link. Sorry, Vicki, do we want to put the link to the resource document in the chat also? I don't know that thank you. So Dani, thank you so much, Dani. She helped put together a document of resources. And so definitely the whole toolkit, all 5 strides, especially stride 1, is a great place to start. But we know folks that want to do this work of thinking about anti-racist teaching and anti-racist math classrooms, there might be other ways that you can like dig in, and the learning is so important. And so lots of other amazing resources in that document that you should check out, and some other workbooks even that you could work your way through. And so that's another way to just continue the conversation. I also wanted to just do a quick plug for our upcoming Coffee and Conversation. We do these about monthly, and if you're interested, all of the previous ones are on our website on achievethecore.org. But the next one is going to be on May 19th, and it's around culturally relevant read alouds in the early grades. And so feel free to go to that Eventbrite link to sign up or register for it, or share it with colleagues if you know other people that might be interested in attending that one. And you can just continue to watch that Eventbrite page for our future opportunities for engagement. And with that, we have about 5 minutes left, but I wanted to leave space for you all to provide feedback for us as we continue doing this work of thinking about anti-racism in classrooms and in schools. These coffee and conversations are a big part of that conversation at our organization. And so we'd love for your feedback around what you found useful, what you found valuable, any ways we could get better and improve. And also the sign up link, the Core Advocate sign up you'll be on our list, and we don't send out too many emails, but if you want opportunities, invites for future events like this, you should sign up there and you'll get our announcements for other professional learning opportunities like this one and like the seminar series we're doing. So we'd love for you to sign up and be part of that community. And with that, any last words, Dani, that you want to close with?
I would just say I want to encourage folks to do this work. Again, it is not easy, but it is the right thing to do. Everyone has space to do this work. Everyone has a responsibility to do this work. And so I really want to encourage you to really do the work. You can do it. You have to do it. And I'm here to do that work with you.
Thank you, Dani. Thank you for being with us this evening. I know I've thought a lot about my work and my role and my practice, and just really love listening to and hearing your wisdom and your experience. So thank you all for being with us. Thank you for your engagement and for being committed to doing this work that really is so critical for students and for kids. So we really appreciate